On Friday, the 5th of September, two reporters from the New York Times, Dave Phillips and Matthew Kolb, published a bombshell piece of investigative reporting. A team of Navy SEALs from the legendary SEAL Team 6, that's the same guys who killed Osama bin Laden, had snuck into North Korea back in 2019. The mission? To plant surveillance equipment that would allow the US to intercept Kim Jong-un's communications amid high-level nuclear talks with President Trump. If successful, this would have provided the American intelligence community with unparalleled insights into Pyongyang. We're talking here about Kim Jong-un's private discussions, his actual stance on the negotiations with Trump, his talks with allies like Russia and China, probably even his views on the latest One Piece arc. You know, the kind of intelligence that analysts would sell their mothers to get. While the potential rewards were great, they were matched, if not outright exceeded, by the risk. If the mission was detected and the SEALs captured, they would become hostages in a hostile state whose human rights record is, to put it mildly, not exactly stellar. There was also a chance that exposure could tank the negotiations or even escalate into conflict. Top Trump officials believed that even the smallest military action against North Korea would provoke a catastrophic reaction. It was such a risky endeavor that it required President Trump's direct approval. This was the kind of mission that needed everything to go right, and it's only now, 6 years later, that we're able to finally see how everything went horribly wrong and how these failures may still be influencing the diplomatic landscape in Asia to this very day. The mission. When Donald Trump first came to power in 2016, he advocated for a much tougher stance on North Korea than his predecessor Barack Obama. Tensions between the two nations ran high in the early days of the administration. Both Trump and then Vice President Mike Pence threatened that North Korea would end up like Libya, a devastated husk of a country whose leader was ousted if Kim didn't give up his nukes. So far, so what the world expected from a Trump presidency. But then, something strange seemed to happen. The relationship thawed. Not just thawed, it became positively sunny. Trump went from calling the North Korean dictator Little Rocket Man and threatening to rain fire and fury on Pyongyang to exchanging letters filled with flowery prose with the isolated world leader. Trump would go on to say that the two, and I quote here, fell in love after exchanging these letters.
And then we fell in love. Okay?
So besotted was Kim that North Korea temporarily stopped testing nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles. Despite these seemingly closer ties, Washington was still unsure about Kim's actual intentions. So, the intelligence community did what it does best. It revealed that it had a way to collect actionable intelligence from Pyongyang and eliminate the uncertainty, a newly developed bit of surveillance tech. The only catch? Someone would have to sneak into North Korea, a country so closed off from the world that it's known as the Hermit Kingdom, and plant the device. That's a task as difficult to pull off as convincing Garfield not to eat John's delicious lasagna. The biggest obstacle to entering North Korea is the geography. To the south, North Korea is separated from South Korea by a 250-kilometer-wide buffer zone known as the DMZ. The DMZ is jointly patrolled by soldiers from the two Koreas, and trying to sneak across it would likely end in an agonizing death. To the north, Pyongyang is separated from China by the Yalu and Tumen rivers. There's a near-zero chance that Beijing would allow the US to use its territory to launch a clandestine mission into North Korea. Even in the unlikely scenario where this happened, the American forces would still have to contend with the army of informants in the North Korean villages along the border. With such insurmountable odds, the mission was assigned to SEAL Team 6 in 2018. Even for a team regarded as one of the world's most elite group of operators, the mission would be extraordinarily difficult. They would have to survive for hours in frigid waters, slip past security forces on land, perform a precise technical installation, and then get out undetected. Now, they'd done something similar in 2005, and they were confident they could do it again. To achieve this, according to sources who spoke with the New York Times, the Navy would sneak a 180-meter-long nuclear-powered submarine into the waters off of North Korea and then deploy two mini-subs that would motor silently to the shore. The mini-subs were wet subs, which meant that the SEALs inside would be floating in near freezing ocean water for about 2 hours. They would use scuba gear and heated suits to keep warm. Near the beach, the mini-subs would release a group of about 8 SEALs who would swim to the target, install the device, and then slip back into the sea. Worse, the SEALs would be going in blind. For special operators, going in blind means that they wouldn't have drones flying overhead providing high-definition video of the target. This video, streamed to the team on the ground and to the leaders in command centers, is crucial to the success of most missions. But in North Korea, a drone would exponentially increase the risk of discovery. Military officials told the Times that in place of drones, the team would have to rely on satellites in orbit and high-altitude spy planes in international airspace miles away that could only provide low-definition still images. Compounding the challenge, the images could not be relayed in real time or transmitted to the mini-subs because these transmissions might reveal their position. The mission had to happen under a near-total communication blackout. To mitigate these challenges, the SEALs spent months in training trying to anticipate any potential challenges. They studied people's movement, fishing patterns, and weather data, and decided that if they arrived in the dead of night in winter, they were unlikely to encounter anyone. But what's that old saying? Even the best laid plans of mice and men? Well, little did they know it, but SEAL Team 6 were about to get a timely reminder of just how foobar even the most carefully planned mission can quickly become. What went wrong? In early February 2019, President Trump announced that he would be meeting Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, Vietnam for a nuclear summit. This would be their second meeting, having first met in Singapore in 2018. Around the same time, the SEALs received the green light to undertake the mission. The New York Times was able to confirm the factors the president considered when approving this mission, as two of the top national security officials at the time, National Security Advisor John Bolton and Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick M. Shanahan, declined to comment. Given the timing, it is plausible that the primary factor the White House considered was their need to get Trump as much information as possible before his sit-down with Kim. Trump had long touted himself as a master of the art of the deal, and if he could make a deal with North Korea, it would cement his legacy. Regardless of the reason, the SEALs were soon in their subs heading for North Korea. On a still calm night, the mini-sub glided towards their target, their sensors indicating that the shore appeared to be empty. Once they got to the location, where they were supposed to park on the sea floor, the team made what the New York Times describes as the first of three small mistakes. According to the original plan, the mini-subs were supposed to park facing the same direction. Unfortunately, one of the subs overshot and had to do a U-turn, and the subs ended up pointing in different directions. Since time was limited, they decided to head to the shore and correct the issue later. One domino had been nudged. The SEALs, carrying untraceable weapons loaded with untraceable ammunition, swam to the shore. Every few meters, they peeked above water to scan their surroundings. Everything seemed clear. That was their second mistake. They didn't spot the small North Korean boat bobbing in the water. To be fair to the SEALs, the sensors in their night vision goggles were designed in part to detect heat, and the wetsuits the Koreans wore were chilled by the cold seawater. The SEALs got to the shore convinced that they were alone. Another domino began to wobble. Back at the mini-subs, one of the pilots revved the electric motor to reposition the sub facing the wrong way. This was the third mistake, as some SEALs believed that the motor's wake might have caught the attention of the North Korean boat. If the crew had turned to investigate the source of the sounds, they might have spotted the light from the submarine's cockpit glowing in the dark water. The final domino tilted forward, its momentum now unstoppable. If each mistake had happened in isolation, then the mission would have probably gone off without a hitch. Unfortunately, like dominoes arranged in a perfect line, the errors cascaded until finally the North Koreans noticed something. Shining flashlights and talking excitedly, the North Koreans began steering their boat towards the mini-subs. Some of the mini-sub pilots would later report that the boat still seemed to be a safe distance away, and they doubted whether they had been spotted. To the SEALs on land, though, it seemed that whoever was in the boat was closing in on the mini-sub's location. Remember when we mentioned that the entire mission had to happen under a near-total communications blackout? Well, that meant that the SEALs on land couldn't radio their teammates underwater to clarify the situation. With no way to discuss the next move with his superiors who were miles away on the main sub, the senior enlisted SEAL fired on the boat. You could probably guess what happened next. If a Navy SEAL decides to take you out, then the only way you're leaving the area is as a corpse, and that's exactly what became of the North Korean fishermen, unarmed civilians who, just through sheer bad luck, happened to be diving for shellfish at the precise moment the SEALs came ashore. Not that the identity of those in the boat mattered. By opening fire, the team had given away their location and potentially compromised the mission. All that remained was to dispose of the bodies, which officials later claimed was done by pulling the bodies into the water and puncturing their lungs to ensure that they would sink. And then they fled the scene. Shortly after, US spy satellites detected a surge of North Korean military activity in the area. Pyongyang didn't make any public statements on the deaths, and most American officials were unsure whether they ever pieced together what had happened or who was responsible. But that doesn't mean there wouldn't be major consequences from this one botched raid. Consequences that may have included killing any hope of a deal on Pyongyang's nuclear program. The nuclear question. And so, backstory filled in, we at last get to the most important bit of this video, the part where we try and weigh up what impact this botched raid did or didn't have. Now obviously, we can only go by information that's publicly available, but even that's enough to make us wonder if there wasn't some reaction to this failed raid behind the scenes. The facts are as follows. At the end of February, Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Hanoi for a 2-day nuclear summit, one that, hard as it seems to believe now, was surrounded by a genuine sense of optimism. In a speech at Stanford University, Andrew Kim, former head of the CIA's Korea Mission Center, gave voice to that optimism. He recounted how Kim told then-Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that he was a father and a husband and didn't want his children to live their lives carrying nuclear weapons on their backs. While such statements point to Kim's softer side, they may have also served a strategic purpose. They humanized the dictator to American officials, painting him as a pragmatic leader capable of compromise. During the summit, Kim would echo this sentiment. Asked by a reporter whether he was willing to shut down his nuclear program, he responded, "If I'm not willing to do that, I wouldn't be here right now." Yet, as all of us sat here in our dystopian future already know, that isn't what happened. What did happen was that the summit was cut short on its second day. The White House claimed it was because Pyongyang demanded ridiculous things like the full lifting of sanctions in return for baby steps. North Korea, for its part, later declared that it had only wanted a partial lifting of sanctions and, in return, would have been willing to completely dismantle its primary nuclear facility in Yongbyon. To be clear, it's entirely possible that this is really what happened. Negotiations, even between allies, fail all the time. The comprehensive economic and trade agreement between the EU and Canada took years to negotiate, over a decade to bring into force, and is still awaiting ratification by multiple European states 11 years after being signed. And that was a basic trade agreement where the biggest sticking point was market access. If that can turn into such a torturous nightmare, then it's easy to see how high-stakes nuclear negotiations between adversaries could collapse all on their own. But there are those who wonder if the cause of the summit's failure wasn't to be found in the talks themselves, but in the botched Navy SEAL raid. David Phillips, one of the authors of the New York Times piece, is one of those who believes this version of events. If North Korean intelligence had managed to piece together what had happened in the raid, even partially, that would have been enough to sink the talks. It would also explain other oddities, like Pyongyang resuming weapon testing soon after the summit. Unfortunately, without official confirmation from the DPRK, this is only going to remain a theory. In the intervening years, North Korea moved even further away from the United States, embracing Russia and China and sending troops to help Moscow in its war with Ukraine. And as it has grown closer to its powerful friends, Pyongyang has become only more uncompromising on its nuclear status. Today, the DPRK's position is that future talks with Washington will only happen if North Korea is recognized as a nuclear-armed state. But while the consequences of this failed raid may have been vast, they're not the only important issue. There's also the question of why this story leaked in the first place. Now, whenever such stories do leak, it's important to ask why. This story had been classified through 2 very different administrations, and the fact that it surfaced more than 6 years later suggests something beyond good investigative journalism. When asked by CNN's Anderson Cooper, David Phillips suggested that his source may have been motivated by a need for accountability. The Trump administration never told key congressional leaders about the mission or their review into it. This worried several military officials because the SEALs' public image has been defined by high-profile successes while their failures are shrouded in secrecy. Quoting Phillips, "The SEALs have this Superman type of reputation in our culture, and a lot of it is deserved, but there's a lot of failures that are classified that nobody ever learns about, including policymakers. So another president may think I could rely on the SEALs to do this and not have an idea of how mixed their record is." It's partly because of this track record that President Obama increased oversight on special operations, reserving complex commando raids for extraordinary situations like hostage rescues. The first Trump administration reversed many of those restrictions and cut the amount of high-level deliberation for sensitive missions. As to whether this story being made public will make much of a difference in the long run, Only time's going to tell. While it's useful to reflect on past failures, the fact is that the window for serious talks with Pyongyang hasn't just slammed shut, it's been bolted closed, bricked over, and then buried deep underground inside a concrete tomb saying, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." With Moscow funneling oil money and new technology to the DPRK in return for shells and missiles to rain down on Ukrainian cities, all while Beijing provides diplomatic cover for Kim, well, let's just say the incentives are no longer in place for a peaceful resolution. And that's a tragedy for the world. Perhaps there never was any chance of a peaceful resolution to the North Korean question. Perhaps the summit in Hanoi was always doomed to end in failure. But if it's true that this one botched raid is what killed the talks, then it may have been one of the most significant military operations undertaken by the United States in the past decade. For that reason, if no other, the world deserves to know about it. Thank you for watching.